The road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Ultimately, companies have not proven themselves at all.
You now have a cost imposed to you by legislation that wasn't there before. Wouldn't you have to make that cost up somewhere else? And where would you have to make it up?
I think if we leave it as is, companies being increasingly anti-consumer with taking titles away from them that they have paid for is going to continue.
I feel like your framing of this is entirely upside down. So, Max, in California, the Protect Our Games Act recently passed. And obviously, everyone over the internet is absolutely ecstatic about this because people for a long time have felt that it's unfair that developers can essentially take away access to a game by shutting down its servers. And there's been a whole movement about it. And you're obviously a massive supporter of this, and you think it would be great if it goes into law. I might actually be on the other side of this. I don't know if this is actually a good thing for gaming. I don't know if it's a good thing for the industry. And that's a very controversial opinion to take, but
Certainly
I think it holds up to scrutiny. But what do you think about this act?
I think it's a brilliant piece of legislation that needed to be passed, and it's been too long. We've had too many cases of games being shut down with zero recourse for customers, and so they've bought a product which ultimately becomes essentially a paperweight in their Steam library or driver, or even in some cases physical. So it's a brilliant step forward.
Whilst there's a lot of demand for it in terms of the movement, it gets tons of likes, tons of positive responses, but I just have a very simple question for you. How many of those people do you think would still buy a game, even if they damn well knew from day one that it would be shutting down in a year? If it was a hot topic game, I think a lot of them would. And so I feel like this movement is, whilst I agree with it on a moral sense, I do think you should own your games. I disagree in the sense that the solution is to impose a law against it, because essentially what the bill says is that under the Act, the obligations of the developer are either a playable offline version of the game. And so that could mean, I think the text is made in a way where basically the interpretation of what an offline version is kind of broad, but essentially you should be able to play the game offline without having to connect to servers, or alternatively, an offline enabling patch or online functionality outside of the company's servers. Alternatively, a full refund of the purchase price. So those are essentially the options at the disposal of the developer or publisher under the Act. Whichever one they choose is kind of up to them.
My technical background would tell me, yes, it would take, I'm not going to, diminish the amount of work required here. It would be considerable work as opposed to what is currently required, which is nothing. Converting let's say it's an MMO, making it offline only, that's going to be a bit trickier than other games which just have online. When it comes to an MMO, I think it is a truly brilliant thing, and it doesn't actually take away many options from the developers. Yes, it would tie some developers up in getting this acceptable for the law, but ultimately it will not take away options. And I want to go back on a point you said here. You said in the EU, if a game is being advertised as shutting down at a certain date, like let's say a year from release date, right? You've only got a year to play it. People who buy it are accepting that. They know that that's going to happen when you go in. Whereas if, like how games are currently, I suspect developers don't really have an intended shutdown date beyond a time frame, and possibly tie that in with revenue. They're two different scenarios, I think. When you tell a consumer upfront that a game is going to be shut down on this date, a person can look at that and go, yeah, no, not for me. Or they can go, yeah, I love the game so much that I'm okay with that. And I think they're two different scenarios.
Okay, I think you're right about that. They are different, inherently different. But I think this kind of goes to my main objection to making something like this a law, and it's unintended consequences of putting forward legislation for something that could be done by the consumer. And in economics, this is referred to as negative externalities. I think it used to be called neighborhood effects by some Austrian economists. But basically, the core concept is you do something for the greater good and everyone supports it. But then when you impose the law, side economic things occur that are inherently negative. And you either have to try to repeal the law or you have to try to make ways around it. And very often it is actually harder to repeal a law than it is to produce a new law, which is unfortunate part of our society where we essentially have laws on top of laws on top of laws. And it's kind of a major issue. So for me, my main objection to this bill, and perhaps you can provide arguments that will convince me otherwise, because I can be convinced, this is something I can be convinced of because I agree with the morality of it. I agree with the sense that a lot of consumers feel slighted by developers shutting down some of their favorite games, and I concur that with their feeling on that. I just don't think making it and enacting a law is the way to go about it. So what would you say to my concerns about how this may have unintended consequences for both the consumer and the developer? And what kind of things can you say to ease my fear on that, so to speak?
Well, first of all, I think it's important that I sort of know what your example of an unintended side effect could be, because I can't really think of too many here, except beyond the tying extra developers up, and it actually ends up costing them money that a company doesn't actually have. Like, let's say they're shutting it down. I suspect it would, logic gives that they're probably not making enough money to sustain the product. And so, what money are they going to pay these developers with? Like, that's the only side effect I can think of, really.
So ironically, I think one of the biggest side consequences of this might be something I'd refer to as sunsetting. Now, obviously, anyone that's played Destiny, this you know where I'm getting this from. But essentially, right now, as it is, before this law is enacted, if I'm a developer, I'm making an online-only game, I may not have an end date in mind for that game. It could be 10 years, it could be 8 years, it could be 2 years, you know what I mean? It very often will be based on the financial side of things, whether it's economic to continue the game, keep the game running. If this law goes into effect and studios now have to also grapple with either the cost of offering refunds to people or the cost of trying to make a offline version of the game, or alternatively outside hosting instructional tools, I think what will happen is developers and publishers, if they make an online game, will kind of write off the end tail of that game. They'll kind of say, okay, if we know we are going to have to pay this price when we end the game, we should set a date in mind for ending that game, because it seems more economic to us if we pick a date and we say, look, we are going to have to pay a cost. Let's cut it here when it makes the most sense, when kind of the linear curve of profitability for the game goes down. As it is right now, that game may just continue for a while longer. That game may just continue for as long until they just give up and they're like, we're done with this. But if they know for a fact at the end of it there is going to be a cost, what that may actually do is they may cut the timeline for that game down. And so consumers will actually end up getting less value out of the games. And I said earlier, for people watching that know Destiny, this occurred in Destiny 2. Content was sunset to make room for new content, which was actually a very beneficial thing when it occurred, because it made memory room. It was due to technical limitations, so that new content could be produced. But now that it has already occurred, people are going back and saying, damn, I really wish we didn't sunset that content. I really wish I could play it to this day. And so that makes me think, if this bill is enacted and companies end up deciding to do that, have we actually screwed the consumer more than they are being right now?
I think that point is a good point. I don't think there's any, massive rebuttal to that beyond the differing of expectations. I mean, obviously the bill isn't in law and we haven't seen it, so there is going to be a lot of what-if-isms around this. But I really I don't see any difference in a developer leaving it open-ended or setting a close date. Because ultimately, I do think it'll be fluid, entirely up to the market, how long that game lasts. I mean, that is, basic economics. So if a game does really well, then I suspect they could extend it. In the same way, if it does really poorly, they'd reduce it. So regardless of whatever they set, I would want to see that actually happen before I'm convinced by that particular argument of, setting a date before will then forcing this law onto companies would then make them set a date that they would shut the game down sooner than they otherwise would. I'm not convinced by that yet, but I could be. I'm not ruling that one out. So what I could offer in terms of, maybe to help sway you here, the idea that when you're purchasing a game or even just playing a game, you are making an investment, and if it's not money, then it's time, right? And if you really are enjoying this game, obviously you can never get the time back no matter what you do. But if you are putting money into it, if you have paid up front, it would feel pretty rubbish that you can no longer access this game. It really goes down to that whole idea of you don't own anything nowadays. Like, let's say this water bottle here. Let's say I bought this water bottle very recently, right? It's now empty. I've drunk it all. But if someone came to me and said, "Oh yeah, you need to give that water bottle back," I'd be like, "Okay, why?" And they said, "Oh, we can't afford to have this out in the open anymore. It's too plasticky. You need to give it back now." I'm like, "Okay, well, I want to keep it." And they say no. And I said, well, can I have a refund? And they say no. I'd be pretty pissed off. Like, they've come into my space and said, I need your item back that you own. When people do that for my games, it's the exact same concept. It's annoying because it's like, well, I've actually paid for it. I should own this. Regardless of the reality of whatever EULA I sign, I still believe that I have paid the money. It shouldn't be they shut it down at an indeterminate time. Like, in contrary to you're saying that it's possibly a negative thing for the consumer. I think it could actually be a brilliant thing, because if this legislation forces them to set a date, then why don't they publish that? They could tell the consumers, hey, the game will probably be sunset here, subject to changes. Does that give you any sort of comfort, even 1%?
No, and I'll tell you why. A couple of things you said there, really, I don't think logically make any sense. So the first one you said, look, the market will decide. Regardless of this legislation, the game will stay on as long as the market makes it worthy. That is true right now. When you introduce this legislation, it may not be true. And the reason for that is sometimes it may not make business sense for games to continue in speculation on economic performance. So for instance, if I were to release my game and it's online only, and I know I'm going to have to pay a fee at the end. Right now, I don't have to pay a fee at the end. All right, there's no law that requires me to give out refunds or to make an offline version of the game and have development costs go into that. So right now, as it sets, I can set a budget and I can say, look, we'll continue the game for as long as it's profitable. Right? If you now introduce a cost by law at the end when I need to close that game down because it's not making economic sense, now in mind as a business to prepare for that and to prepare for that extra cost, I now have to go into it with the mindset of this will probably be shut down at some point. Let's pick a date now, right? And even if the game is doing economically better than we expect, if it's not dramatically outperforming expectations, then the game will end up getting closed down on that day. It makes business sense for them to do that, right? For them to set a sunsetting date, which right now they wouldn't, because it doesn't make business sense. If you're not being punished at the end when it's no longer economical to keep the servers on, it doesn't make any sense for you to have a date in mind to close it down. So that's one major issue. A second, I have a major objection with your example, right? You talk about buying a bottle of water and having it taken away from you. It's kind of a false analogy. What it would actually be like, Max, and what you're actually regulating here is if me and you talked and you said, hey, Josh, I would like to use your bottle of water. I would pay you for it. And I said, that's great, Max, on the condition that you can only use it for as long as I deem it's okay, and then I want it back. And then understanding that, you still paid me the money, then you drank some of the water, and then say an hour later, I said, actually, Max, I want it back now. And then you say, what the hell, man, I'm drinking my water. And I say, well, the original agreement between us two was that you would have the water for X period of time, and I could take it back whenever I please. So if we enter in that agreement between two private parties and then this legislation comes to effect, essentially I can't offer you that option. For me personally, now I have to impose a personal cost onto myself that I wasn't doing before in order to select it. It's very much disincentivized as it wasn't previously. The difference between now and once this legislation goes into effect is companies are like able to be more speculative now. They're able to take more risk because there's no cost at the end date that they're going to be forced to pay. My logic is when this legislation comes into effect, companies might be more incentivized to pick a date or to end the game earlier than they would have because there is now a cost imposed and because they have to worry about that cost after the fact. Right now, as it stands, yes, games will be stopped, whenever they deem it no longer economical, but they might be more willing as a company to take the risk of improving the player count for a longer period of time because there is no exit fee. And when you impose an exit fee, now they may not be more willing to do that. And so as a result, you may have shorter term games, which is an unintended negative externality that no one might have thought about before imposing this legislation. And I don't actually think, this whole act and all the morality behind this act is essentially that the consumer should have more rights. The consumer should have a right to the product they paid for, etc., etc. What about the rights of the consumer to play the product for longer? What about the rights of the consumer that may be a developer at the company that ends up getting cut because the extra cost imposed and it's no longer economical to keep another person or another two people on the development team? If we're going to impose a law, and these are genuine things which may or may not happen, and there are real side consequences to these things, why would we impose the law and think, well, if it's bad, we can oppose it later? Well, no. The threshold from making a law should be a lot higher than someone just going, we'll test it, we'll see what happens. Well, no, because then we have to go through the entire rigmarole of then repealing the law, which, as we established at the start of this conversation, is something that seems almost impossible with government these days.
It is.
So I think the burden of proof is actually on the people like yourself, Max, that are very much in favor of this law to explain to me why my fears will not happen. Not that they may not happen, not that they may be illogical, etc., but that they will not happen. Because if they do occur and these negative externalities come into effect, when the law is there and the law is the law, it is going to be extremely hard to justify those same lawmakers to go back and repeal the legislation.
Again, I'm sorry, I'm just not convinced by that argument. I'm just not. I like the cost of developing a game is astronomical, right? And if we're talking about the games that this is specifically targeting in MMOs and the like, they're already sinking such a huge amount of money, right? There is zero. I don't like every company is going to be different. Every title is going to be different. There is no. I think it's really hard to assign a cost to that. So I can't use that as an argument because for one developer, it might cost a day of a developer's time, which is, $400 or whatever it is. I think the idea of the law is not to force them to give refunds. Like that is not a viable business option. Like that, you and I both know that. Like, let's say the game makes 100 million. Are they just going to say, well, yeah, we've spent all this money upkeeping this game, have your 100 million back? Like that's not going to happen. That's not realistic. So that is there to incentivize companies to actually make this game available offline in other senses. Here's another argument for you. I mean, I don't like the idea of an MMO being entirely offline. That suck. That's boring as. But I think the actual concept of this law is to say to developers, you should give people reasonable access to online servers. And a game that actually has done this is Terra. I can't remember if it was intentional or not, but it's a MMO from a little while ago. It shut down with very little warning in 2021, I think, at the end of 2021, somewhere around there. It shut down with very little warning, but there were community servers the entire time. And so the game is still very much accessible because the community servers are running. The official servers are long gone, but the game still has a fairly sizable community. It's not massive. It's not what it was, of course, but they can't do anything to the game. They can only do server-side stuff, which is, it sucks. But for people who love it, they could still play it. And I think that's the idea behind it. That's what I'm interpreting it as. And so when it comes down to it, the cost that the developers now have to burden, because there is going to be a cost, I think is minimal. And also complying right now, once their timeline is done, the game is closed. Like there is no more that will ever be done to it. Surely you could also agree that at the very least, right, a developer could get some really good PR off this, whether they're forced to or not. Right now, the precedent is it'll be closed, and now the developer can use it and say, we're going to sunset this game on X date. And so I do think that argument about their timeline is going to be shorter because of this law, it doesn't sit right at all. Like I don't think that is a realistic thing, because at the end of the day, they're still going to have a date set, regardless of whether this law is passed or not. And it will all then be up to what the market says about the game. How long are people playing it for? How much revenue are they pulling in from microtransactions and expansions, etc.? And I just don't think that changes with this law at all.
I just want to tackle this concept, all right? Because the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And no matter the intentions surrounding how this law is written or the morality behind it, it doesn't matter if the consequences are actually worse than what it was before the law went into effect. And so I feel like your framing of this is entirely upside down. And this isn't, no matter how you describe it, this is not only a law which will impact big studios, right? You said, most games that are like MMO style are based around bigger studios that make a tons of money and they already have giant budgets. They could account for this cost in it. What about a game like Forever? Forever is a recent game that came out in May by a very small indie team, and it is an MMO. It's a very cutesy MMO. People watch the trailer. It seems like a very passion project centric project. It's in early access. It's basically like their version of an MMO Zelda is what I'm getting from. This is not a giant studio. Shiro Games is not a 500 developer studio. If they were to develop this game and have released it after the law, if it goes into effect, of course, I think it would impose a dramatic cost to their team. And I think as a result, if the game is not as successful as they need to, maybe it might have been successful enough for them to make another game, but maybe not as successful as they need it to be. I think what would happen is they would reap the negatives of this law, and they would have to either pay out the refunds or make the entire MMO offline or provide some alternative for the server functionality. For a smaller team that money matters to, this law will have a terrible consequence. And as a result, I think to offset that cost on development, I think what would happen is that Shiro Games would have to cut, how many developers' salary makes up the difference. And I don't like the idea that people would possibly lose jobs because of a law enacted that didn't need to be enacted. The entire difference this law is making, in my mind, is something that could be done by the consumers themselves. There is a very simple way you are able to incentivize such behavior in a free market. You buy the games that do it, and you don't buy the ones that don't from the companies that are terrible. It's honestly that simple. If there is an economic incentive for a company to do something that we deem being good, then they will do it. If there is not, then they won't. And just another quick thing to counteract a point you made earlier about you don't think that there's a high likelihood of my example of sunsetting going into effect that wasn't already happening. Marathon obviously came out from Bungie. It is an online-only game, and it has dramatically underperformed to the point where they're having to consolidate all development around Marathon, and they basically axed Destiny, which everyone has been depressed by, and Marathon itself is hemorrhaging players. It is doing absolutely god-awful, and Sony actually mentioned it in one of their earnings calls, and basically said, look, we're going to let the game run, it will complete its first year, yada, 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 basically. If there was an additional cost, and Sony was looking at the books, and they said, okay, well, we've had to shelve development on Destiny, which actually has more players than Marathon right now, would it make economic sense for us to actually see out that first year of content? And in my mind, I don't think Sony would commit to that. I think if they're like, well, crap, now we got to also commit to doing this as well, it doesn't make economic sense. Sorry, guys, wrap it up, on to the next project. And Bungie will be forced to move along because Sony bought them. That's an actual example where there isn't current a specific end date in mind, but there may be if this law went into effect. And overall, I do think all of this comes under the banner of we do not know. And if we do not know with at least some certainty the effect this law is going to have, we shouldn't impose the law.
I mean, that is a nice sentiment at the end there. I do stand by that in some senses, but ultimately companies have not proven themselves at all. There was I really think that whole concept of don't buy the game. Yeah, you and I would do that. But if someone knows that they're going to really enjoy the game, like let's say they've watched gameplay online, or they've watched their friends play it, or there's a demo available, whatever it might be, if they've played it, saying you and I would out of principle not buy it, but I don't think it's fair to expect every single person to adhere to that. I wish it was. I wish that was the world we lived in, but unfortunately we don't. So I don't think that's a realistic expectation. And also, like, there is no telling if a developer is going to scum you over in the sense that they'll shut down way sooner. There is no way to know unless a game is flopping hard, like the one you mentioned at the end there. I mean, obviously there is always that idea that if you want to make some money, you better make a bloody good game, right? And so in this example, I don't think the law makes any difference whatsoever for whatever the title you mentioned at the end there.
If the development team knew they had to pay a cost versus they don't have to pay a cost, it makes sense that the 1 year speculative run they're going to give Marathon to see if they can recruit player base may be less incentivized if there is a cost associated with closing it down. Does that make sense?
It does.
If I have to pay something as opposed to not having to pay something, I may be less inclined to continue losing money on the game to see if I can turn it around. If I also know I have to pay a cost, does that not make sense? That
it does make
not
sense.
track?
It does make sense. But in doing so, if you choose as a developer to do nothing, then you're leaving the consumer completely high and dry. You're giving them no recourse, and movements in the past have not, generally speaking, resulted in many successful results in getting access to the game. I believe you can still. I think the crew was reinstated on Steam or some weird, funky technicality there. I don't quite know how it actually ended up, but very rarely have you actually seen community action lead to results when it comes to mega corporations like EA. I think at the end of the day, it'll come down to what can you do with your entire development pipeline in order to actually respect this law. And so my angle will always be the consumer at the end of the day has zero protections right now, zero. And so, $100 for people can be a lot. And, even more if you've spent it on microtransactions. Yes, you should always go into an MMO or whatever game it is, thinking and knowing that it will be shut down at some point, whether that's 20 years or 2 years. You should have that in mind, and when you're spending money. But I still believe firmly that if you pay for the game in any sort of way, or you play it, like you spend time or money on it, you should still have access to it once it's closed. And right now there is zero incentive for developers to do that. And I think there should be some level of incentive to make an effort. This is forcing them to do more than just an effort. And so I'm really happy that there is some recourse for consumers when the developers eventually go, no, go on, see you later. There's nothing you can do about it.
That word incentive is interesting to me. They used at the end there because when we're talking about there is no incentive for the consumer to do X, Y, Z. What we're really talking about is there demand for X, Y, Z? Because in order for businesses in the game space to make decisions, they essentially have to base it on, does it make them money? Right? And so if what you're saying is true, and there is incredible amounts of consumer worry about this, which it seems like from all the Twitter likes and the movement from the Stop Killing Our Games, where it's called in Europe, right? It seems like there is a general populace out there that truly is worried about this. My argument, though, is on the whole, if you took gamers as an overall sort of population, it does seem like, as a total percentage, it seems like it's actually quite low. This fear of my game just shutting down on me because it's online only is actually fairly low. And so I feel like this law is actually in search of a problem, in the sense that the consumer couldn't change it on their own because there wasn't enough consumer demand that agreed to not buy a game because of the possibility that it shuts down because it's online only. And as a result, essentially the people that are really, annoyed by this, which is fair enough, they've now gone to the legislature to legislate and mandate it. So there wasn't enough consumer demand from other consumers to say, don't do this thing. So we're going to go around those consumers and say, guess what? We're going to make it law. And now there is no choice. Now that has to be complied with. And I feel like it's kind of a fault underlying this whole argumentation, because when you get down to the brass tacks, they're not taking away a product they sold you. What they are doing is they sold you a service. You agreed to using that service and buying it, understanding in their EULA, in their agreement, that yes, they will be able to turn the servers off when they deem fit. And you still bought the thing. I think, in actuality, that's a problem with your general consumer. And if you have an objection to that, great. I do too. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm not going to buy that game. And I'm going to tell everyone I know. And I'm going to make YouTube videos. And I'm going to make tweets. And I'm going to say, guys, do not buy this game because you do not own it. They say in the EULA, it's a service, right? Subnautica 2, they say in the EULA, it's a service. I think the harsh reality that people like you that are on that side have to contend with, Max, is that the reason there are not enough consumers going with you and saying, yes, let's boycott this, is because they would rather the fun product for, 3 years that goes offline than not play the fun product, period. And this legislation is not going to help them, because if it does turn out to be the case that company ends up picking a date because of this legislation, that consumer that didn't care in the first instance has actually been hurt by this legislation. And I don't think thus far you've made any compelling arguments to like kind of quell my fears that this may be what happens, that this may be one of many possible negative outcomes. And another negative outcome that I feel like you haven't contended with, that maybe you can now, I'm going to give you the opportunity, of course, is development costs when it comes to jobs. If it is the case that I have to pay a fee at the end to either change or modify the game or to pay out refunds, why wouldn't I as the business say, well, crap, we got to cut a few staff loose to make up the back end on the budget? Is that not a negative? Is that not a negative outcome from this bill? People losing their jobs because there wasn't enough consumer demand for the game, and now maybe you would have kept your job, but now because there's an extra cost imposed, now you get the slight by the company. I think that's a possible negative outcome or negative externality that no one has considered.
I mean, as you said, we just don't know. Right now, we're all talking about what ifs, right? And they're reasonable. I'm saying they're not, but I think that's very it feels alarmist to me, because what's to say, what is to say that they would start laying off people because they can't afford to do that. That could happen. You're right, it very much could, but will it? I mean, I can't logically come back from that because there's no precedent. And so, you're right. Yes, increased cost equals, well, we have to make cuts somewhere. Sure. Logically it holds, but I would like to see that actually happen. But
if it does happen and it's law,
terrible.
Now what happens, Max? Now we have to repeal it, don't we? So shouldn't we make laws based on certainties? Shouldn't we make laws based on certainties rather than speculation?
Logic holds, yes, but in the same way that a consumer completely loses out on the thing that they should, they don't. We all know this, but they should have a right to be able to play, because ultimately, yeah, you're right. You enter in an agreement and you should know, but at the end of the day, as a consumer, you have zero recourse right now. And going back on on your point there about incentives for consumers to do it. I mean, ultimately, you could make as much noise as you want, but the reality is people are still going to buy the game. Again, you and me would both not. We would both say, they're gonna close this down. Either we have to accept that, or we're not going to buy it. We're going to vote with our wallet. But the general consensus is no. And your question would then be, logically, why does the developer have to own that? Well, they are putting out a product. They are putting something out to the world and saying, here is what we've made. And I think if a consumer chooses to spend their money and or time on it, they should then have some reasonable expectation to be able to play that for as long as they wish. And I just disagree that, the average consumer, will vote with their wallet. Like that just unfortunately doesn't happen in our society. Like, people want to play the game, and it outweighs their belief that a game should last forever. And it's hard to argue against that as well, because it's reality, and you're exactly right. You're logically right in saying that they shouldn't.
It's kind of a problem in your argument, no? If the average consumer doesn't really mind, and as long as the game is good, they'll buy it.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
Why not? If it's a serious protection lapse, surely they would care about it. I mean, it's happened in literally every other industry of the market where a protection lapse has occurred and people care, and thus then they rally around, they boycott the product or company, and the product or company has to change, no? Has that not happened in virtually every industry of the marketplace?
And in the same way, I could come back and say, well, there's also been cases where the consumers have rallied massively and nothing has changed. The Crew, for example. I'm just going to keep going back to that.
Can you actually point me, because this example, The Crew, kind of baffles me, because yes, an online service game was shut down and the people that bought that game can no longer access it, right?
Yeah.
How many people, because a lot of this kind of uproar comes from those affected, right? Like they really wanted to play the game and now they can't, right? I wonder to myself though, is this legislation actually going to affect more consumers in a bad way than the consumers that have already been impacted by a live game shutting down? What I mean by that is, can you honestly sit here and tell me on this call that the player base for The Crew was ginormous or substantive before they shut it down? Because my argument is going to be, it probably wasn't. And a lot of these games that get shut down because there's no economic incentive for the company to continue, there's no economic incentive because there's not many damn players playing it. And so the true number of people impacted by a service going down is so unbelievably small that playing and chancing and maybe this, maybe that with a law seems very, very problematic. It seems like to be entirely baseless.
I don't think you can say that just because it's a low number, we shouldn't be trying to make change. I don't think that's. I don't think the size of the player base actually matters. It is important to know why a game is being shut down. I accept that, but at the same time, The Crew was a full price game, and it was online only, and it was advertised as such. There's no false advertising going on here, but when they shut the servers down, you couldn't even launch the thing, so you couldn't play it in any reasonable way, even if you wanted to. I should probably do some more reading into the technical background of all that, and if what changes have since been made, I'll also accept that. But the principle is still there, that they are taking it away from you, and I just don't like that personally.
You just don't like it, so we're going to legislate a law to prevent it. Okay, the reason why the player base matters, and the reason why how large of an impact group matters, is because if it's very small and there is potential for serious consequence of a law going into effect, then you have to kind of weigh that up. You have to kind of say, okay, if this law is meant to help, the group of 30, the group of 50 that were impacted, but it may hurt, 100, then maybe we don't go and chance it with this law, because there doesn't seem to be enough utilitarian benefit to doing that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So you kind of, the burden is kind of on you to prove to me that these fears I have are kind of entirely false and that they will not happen before you put the law into effect. And then also, the burden of proof is on you to tell me that the impact group is so large that we must legislate it. This is doing serious harm to consumers. There's poison in the strawberries. We must immediately enact a law to get every strawberry checked, at a plant. That's kind of what your burden is. And I don't think thus far in this argument you've given me anything other than, that may not happen. It hurts consumers because they can't access it. Well, the consumer group in question, how big is it? I don't know. But we need the law to protect us. We have no protections. We need it. Protections from what? If there isn't a consumer demand to disincentivize this behavior, and you can't prove it through the dollars because companies are still doing this shitty behavior, right? That in our opinion is shitty, but to another consumer, they may not give a fuck. And so as a result, once again, it goes back to, can you prove to me that this law is going to be good when it is enacted? And can you prove to me that there is a reason to enact it?
I mean, again, I could ask you the exact same. Prove to me that it's bad. Prove to me that it will be bad. Prove to me that it will
That's not
cause
my
people.
burden, though, because I'm not in.
I
A
disagree
law
with
is
that.
basically a piece of tyranny in a way when it comes to if it is bad. Like, for example, the prohibition, right? If you sat there, the burden of proof should have been on the people trying to put that bill forward, because there was a lot of morality around the prohibition. Drinking is bad, right? Drinking causes all these harms. And then it went into effect, and the side consequence was all the crime that got involved, and the killings, and the people doing alcohol smuggling, you know? And so they had to repeal it. So the burden of proof is on the person proposing the law, not the person opposing the law going into effect.
I mean, fair. The prohibition example is totally fair, but the thing that I'll always go back to is developers right now they have no reason to give access to a game that someone has paid for. I'm going in circles here, but like that is absolutely true. And ultimately, I think you're right. The utilitarian perspective, if it, it was absolute worst case scenario is what you're presenting here, and so I guess like I would have to ask you as well. What precedent is there in the sense that people will lose their jobs if you're asking them to change how they develop their game a little bit? I don't think I don't think it's small, but I also don't think it's so massive that they're going to have to lay people off. Because ultimately those developers are still there. They're still going to be producing all their, the server-based code, whatever it is. And so in the short term, there may be some growing pains. 100% there could be. But I think in the long term, when you're starting from ground zero, if this law passes, knowing that you're going to have to adhere to this, it will just change how the development life cycle happens. I don't think that it's going to make such a monumental impact that it's going to cause people to lose their jobs. I just don't see it, because like. Is there? I'm genuinely asking is there precedence for that happening in the gaming
literally
industry?
Well, I mean, no, because a law like this has not been imposed, so I can't give you a precedent for a law that hasn't existed yet, right? But what I can say is, in economics, in every logical argument you could make, when a cost is imposed upon a business or company, that cost has to be made up somewhere else. And if it is staff, it's staff. If it's less assets in the game, it's less assets in the next game, right? The negative has to come from somewhere. If you're imposing a cost on them, they're a business. They have to make up that cost somewhere. And what I'm saying is, if a game fails and you've got this giant development team, which you're already going to have to make, horrible cuts to, which happens all the time in the gaming industry, it follows that if there is additional cost, that they may cut more people than they would have otherwise. And as a result, I think that's a negative. I mean, I don't think anyone that's watching this video needs a degree in economics to understand that's 100% true. If you're a business person, I'm talking now to the people, if you're a business person and you now have a cost imposed to you by legislation that wasn't there before, wouldn't you have to make that cost up somewhere else? And where would you have to make it up? Because no matter where it comes from, no matter if it's in their next game, and it harms the consumers that buy that game because that game is less good, because there was less money to go towards assets, towards developers, or it was through job cuts, or it was through other means, no matter where it is made up, there is a serious problem there. Wouldn't you agree, person watching this video?
Yep. That all makes sense, but I do really think it's so hard to say. The law is not in effect, and yeah, you're right, repealing it, tricky. But I think if we leave it as it is now, the consumer is never going to have any sort of meaningful right to a game that they own, and the journey of companies being increasingly anti-consumer with taking titles away from them that they have paid for is going to continue. And so, yeah, I understand, when there is a cost imposed on a business, then yes, absolutely. But it really will come down to how much is that cost. Refund, if it was specifically you had to give a refund, yes, I am with you all the way. I think that would be so incredibly risky and obviously stupid. But when it comes down to make a tool so people can actually access the servers, you could put them on, for example, there is an option of where you can set up I don't quite know what it's called, but it's like the Steam networking function. Essentially, you can tell. I've never actually done this, so I might have the details wrong here, but you could tell Steam, I want to set up a server for this game. Download all the files to my computer. They have, all the DRM protections necessary, and it will run a server on your computer for the game that you want. And so then you could deploy that to your own servers, or have your friends, or set up publicly, whatever it might be. And so yeah, that's an option. Absolutely. What's the cost of that? We don't know. In the same sense that I think it's very alarmist to be saying, oh, millions of people are going to lose their jobs, yada, yada.
I didn't say millions of people.
I
It could be one or two. It could be one or two.
Which
it could be one or
bad.
two. I think that's significant. If
bad.
per company,
Absolutely.
I think that's horrible. I think that's an actual genuine negative cost. And now, just quickly on that, because you just said it, right? You don't know what the cost imposed is, and I don't know what the cost imposed is. Don't you think before we should cheer on a law and say, yes, it should go into effect, yes, we should legislate this, we should do an analysis with professionals in the field to understand what that cost might be? Because I personally think if we're going to impose a cost on a business for California as a whole, we should know that. And if we don't know that, guess what? We should oppose it until we know for a fact what that average cost will be. And if you don't know it, Max, I strongly urge you to swap sides here and say, look, unless I know what that cost imposed is, unless I can look at an amount and say, okay, development companies can make that up somewhere else that isn't through jobs or isn't through making their next game worse, that we should hold off. We should wait. We should sit on the sideline until that study is done. But instead, you're advocating for this law to go into effect. This is great for consumers. They need protection. What about all the other problems, And so can't we come on, Max.
Like, can't
you
I absolutely
at least say
100% agree that we should absolutely have some sort of cost analysis if it hasn't already been done. And if it's excessive, well, yeah, sure. Then we have to then do more analysis on that and figure out, what would businesses take those costs from? Would that be from the consumer increasing the price of the game? That probably is going to be the most likely. Well, actually, no. That's
a potential
generalization.
another negative externality. What do you know?
That seems fair. That seems like a generalization. But regardless, you're right. Absolutely right. We should do an analysis, and logic would then dictate that you need to oppose it until that is done. But in your mind, what would be something that would actually make you swap? Let's say they do that. What would you need to see in order to...
That's a very fair question. That is a very fair question, Max, and I can give you an honest answer. If you were to take people, because I don't think this analysis should be done for just the top end of the game industry, right? Because this law affects all of them. So I think taking the developers, if Shiro Games from Far Ever, as an example, if they were in California, what is a cost to them in addition to their development costs to make something like that small MMO? What is something that could be sustained? So for example, if the cost was like $1,000, I think they would say we can sustain that. If the cost was $60,000, maybe they couldn't. Does that make sense? So any cost that is essentially under under a net negative for them that they can't make up through just, saying, well, we've got to write it off. If you could tell me that these negative externalities are also kind of entirely unlikely, if you could show me the cost and say, look, we've done this analysis, Josh, this is the cost imposed, it's $1,000. I'd be like, okay, that's reasonable. I'm sure if they can make a tool for $1,000 to offset their game, that's just fine. It'll be fine for indie devs. It'll be fine for the larger studios. If it's greater than that, like dramatically greater than that, then I think there needs to be serious questions of whether or not this law is doing more harm than good.
And so to summarize your position, you are not actually opposed to the content of the bill. You're opposed to the idea that this is being forced without any sort of actual, analysis.
No, I'm opposed to the bill philosophically in the sense that I think this is something that the market should decide on its own. I don't think a legislature should do that. But if you can show me a cost and say, look, this is the cost being imposed on average to AAA companies, indie devs, and it's something that is entirely sustainable for each of those respective companies and businesses, you have a much easier time convincing me to get over the philosophy part of it, right? Because then I can say, look, what is the net gain? What is the net negative? You know what I mean? And if the net negative for me is it may rise cost for consumers, it may lose people jobs, it may increase the instance of sunsetting. If you can say, well, the cost is only, this, then I can say, okay, maybe my fears are very watered down now because the cost is so low that it generally won't have any sort of market force outside of that intended. But because you can't do that, I think you by default should oppose something until you know the effect of it for near certainty. Because once a law is made, it's made, and then it's done, boys.
Yeah, that seems reasonable to me. And look, I think we could go in circles for years because I'm not convinced that we should stop this and never pass it. And I'm not sure if that's what you're arguing, but it sounds like you would rather it never be introduced than be introduced. And that, yeah. I disagree with that.
We're going around circles 100%. I just have one more thing to discuss with you before we end this, because it's already been a long discussion. I'm sure people in the comments will have some great opinions and we can read through them. As just a general principle, right? For everyone watching this and yourself, Max, people oppose the idea that a developer can take away their game, right? That makes sense. And I'm in agreement. I think that's immoral, right? And so I won't buy it. When it comes to online service games, and they state in their EULA, look, we can turn off the servers whenever we please, and at which point you will lose access to the game. And the consumer buys it anyway. And even if they know that, they'll buy it anyway and they'll play the game. And then the game gets shut down, in 3, 4, 5 years, whenever. And they get mad and they say, no, I should still have a right to the game. I kind of have an objection to, I agree with the morality of, I think more developers shouldn't put that in their EULA. I think that concept is bad. But if they do put it in their EULA, and people still are outraged when the server gets shut off, does that make sense to you, Max? Because to me, if I'm one party to an agreement and another party stipulates something I don't like, I won't go into the agreement. But it seems like a lot of people on your side, and I'm sure you'd agree with this, that even knew about the problem. Subnautica 2 had tons of media about it in their EULA, but people, presumably, who even objected to that game, still probably thought, well, I'm going to buy it anyway because I'm going to enjoy the game. And that doesn't make sense to me, because if you understand part of the agreement and you don't like it, that's when you should stop. There's nothing forcing you into that agreement. You can just say no. So if you then agree to it, and then they shut the game off later, and then you're outraged, that doesn't make sense to me, because you've already agreed to that part of the agreement.
I think that's, as I was saying earlier, I agree with you. I don't buy games if they've got that shit in the EULA. I think it's so unbelievably anti-consumer and cringe. And so the idea of this law, the spirit of the law is to protect. And you're right. We don't have the analysis. You're absolutely right. We don't. And I do agree that we need it. That is a concession that I will absolutely give you. There should be a cost analysis. At the same time, these companies that are releasing these massive games are making a significant amount of money. And you're right, the cost has to come from somewhere, and where are they going to cut it? If it's a people, then I am completely opposed to it. Any single person losing their job over it, terrible, absolutely terrible. And so if I was sitting in the chambers right now without that analysis, I would push it back and say, you need to give me actual analysis if you haven't done that already. At the end of the day, you're absolutely right. And I think the utilitarian perspective is one that can be fair. But at the same time, I think if we sit here and actively choose to do nothing, actively choose to, not even send, it still has to pass the Senate and it still has to go through the governor. I think even if it fails, I think it is still a really good warning shot to developers to say, hey, you guys need to actually start behaving and, doing better by the consumer. Otherwise, this will happen and there will be a cost to you. And I think that is a brilliant message, unless it costs people jobs. That's when I draw the line. And so how can you guarantee as legislature to make sure to ensure that no people will lose their jobs? You cannot. That is not a reasonable expectation, because as the small developer example that you gave, how the fuck
Forever. Yep.
Yeah, how could they realistically not cut people? Because I suspect that is going to be their biggest expense. Whether that be server maintenance or people maintenance, whatever, something will have to give. You're right about that. But I do think if we sit here and do nothing, consumers will continue to have the no rights that they have right now. So for me, this is a step in the right direction. And you're absolutely right in the sense that we should have to prove that there will be no negative impact. But I also do think that there is something to be said that if we sit here and try and don't do anything at all, then nothing will change. We'll continue to have games be shut off. Are we just going to sit there and do absolutely nothing, or are we actually going to go to the legislator and say we need to actually do this? That's what I believe should be the better approach to this. But I think, Josh, you will continue to disagree with me.
I'm going to get a lot of criticism for this video, because I understand there is a large movement of people that are very anti the idea that a game can be shut off. And I do get it. I do understand it. But my plea to those people is, before you enact a law, you should know what that law's outcome is going to be. You shouldn't be speculative, it should be known. And if you don't know it, you shouldn't enact the law. And the second thing I'd plead to you people watching this here now is, if a game's EULA says you don't own the game and you have a serious problem with that, it is your moral obligation as a consumer that has an opinion on that topic, that wants to enact change, to not buy that game. And if you go on to buy that game anyway, I'm sorry, I'm no longer on your team. I'm no longer on your team to say you've been wronged. Because if you agreed to the EULA and you played that game and the EULA said you don't own it and you're mad you don't own it, that's on you. That's not on the developer. That's not on me. That's on you. Because you understood that and bought it anyway.
In the case that, you a single player game, let's say it has shut down and you can't launch it anymore. You put the disc in and it says, sorry, you can't load this game up. On the developer side, their agreement that they signed with, say, a third party to have their music in the game, or certain assets that can't be easily swapped out. What do you say to that?
So if a company sells me a product, they don't tell me they can take it away from me at any time, and then they put forward a patch, because I presume with a single player game they'd have to, if there's no online capacity that they could shut down. If they put forward a patch that disables my access to the game, I presume I could go down the civil route and sue the fuck out of that company, because I've paid for a product and we had an agreement. Okay, I've attained the product, and now I can sue the ever living daylights out of that company because I no longer have access to that product, and they didn't tell me they were going to take it away or could take it away at any point.
Okay. Yep. And so an example of this would, Minecraft is also an online, but it's the same product. Minecraft is an example of this happening a little different. If you did this, and this is absolute fucking bullshit. Fuck you, Microsoft, for this. If you didn't migrate your Minecraft account onto a Microsoft account, it's gone. It's gone forever. You cannot. There is zero recourse for you. So there is someone actually, pursuing legal action for this. Because they're initiating a class action in some Nordic country, I believe. Because it actually violated laws over there. Well, they were alleging that they do anyway. I remember reading about this or watching something about this. I think in 2024, maybe 23. And to my knowledge, this hasn't even been presented to a court yet. This is such a long process to play out. And
a class action, yes.
Yeah. Class action is different. You're absolutely right. A class action is different. But a civil case, that's going to also take a long time, no? And extremely expensive.
Very, yeah.
And so,
granted, this is something that could be done pretty inexpensively, at least in Australia. But regardless.
Yeah, well, because we have good consumer protections, because we have laws protecting us. In countries like the US, they don't really have those sort of. They're not lucky enough.
They have tribunals, though. I presume this is something that could be heard by a tribunal.
Possibly.
Legal experts will have to weigh in the comments, but this is something that could presumably be heard at a tribunal or something that you could represent yourself. Yeah,
absolutely. I don't think that is a particularly accessible route for people who, like the average person who works a 9 to 5 and doesn't have unlimited budget to go after a massive company to say, hey, you took away my single player game and you had no right to.
Well, if I'm just thinking in my head, like if I went to Macca's and I paid for a burger and I got home and they put the wrong shit on the burger I paid for, even though I selected the right one, like, yes, there is civil recourse, and yes, I could call them up. But if they say get fucked, I don't know if I should now go on a campaign to get a law imposed against Macca's to say you cannot make mistakes because you gave me the wrong fucking burger.
Yeah.
Once again, it kind of weighs on the balance of is this really an impact or that is affecting in a dramatic way consumers? And then once again, I don't think that is a demonstration of a serious impact. That's a demonstration of someone losing $40-$50 as opposed to a law going into effect that would impact many, many other people. And so I don't know if I really think there's any law you could put forward, depending on language, unless you use very limited language, that wouldn't also require you to go through the legal system to get an action out of. Like for your instance, right, this California law, if they broke it, presumably someone would have to take many, many months, years, however long the legal system works anyway, to get a recourse out of it, no?
Probably,
there would still be that time delay. And so your argument kind of applies no matter what.
No, but it wouldn't be up to the people that do it, would it not be? Or is that I actually don't know how that works. Like if a company breaks the law, then surely it's going to be the Justice Department who actually follows that up, no? Rather than an individual in a civil case.
Well, that's a good question. That's a good question that we would need to answer.
We don't
is
know
this
the
a
answer to
consumer because a consumer protection law in Australia, the way it works is it is a law, but you actually have to go and petition it yourself.
Very good point. Very good point.
And so now I wonder, okay, once again, we don't know.
We're not Americans. We don't know.
We're not Americans. Please answer in the comments what kind of recourse you have if, say, in Max's example, right, where there was no EULA agreement and they literally just took away your game that you paid for. what recourse would you have to be able to get that back? If let's actually use the best example. If this California law was in place, will the Justice Department go after it? Would California's legislature? Who helps you, or do you just have to do it yourself, like in the other instance? Because if they do have to do it themselves, Max, I mean, I hate to say it, but that would look really bad for your side.
No, well, if you have to do it yourself and you have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to prove a company fucked you over and broke the law, what the hell is the point of it? Anyway, well, we've yapped on for long enough. We both really want to know what the hell you think as well. Tell us if we're both wrong. Tell us if we're both idiots. Tell me if I'm an idiot. I would love to be roasted. It'd be very funny. But also tell Josh if he's wrong.
That's right.
We're all about discussions here. There is no wrong opinion unless you're on the opposition to me. No, of course not. We're free opinions. Say whatever you wish in the comments. Be respectful to each other, but we'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you very much for watching.